rail fence up the hill, and beyond it, a barn with a lantern swinging just inside the doorway. She hesitated only a second, then climbed the fence. Inside the barn, a man stood brushing down a bay gelding, his back to her. He moved slow and steady, like someone used to silence. He wore a wide-brimmed hat low over his dark brown hair, and the sleeves of his shirt were rolled high, revealing strong, work-calloused arms. She stepped forward, the boards creaking under her boots. He turned, eyes narrowing under the brim. "You lost," Keziah's voice cracked. I need help." He looked her over once, not with judgment but with concern. She was muddy, bloodied at the knees, and clutching the torn remains of what was clearly a wedding dress. He set the brush down. "Come on inside. You look half dead." She followed him across a short stretch of yard to a small, low house with smoke curling from the chimney. The door opened on a warm room, simple and clean. A fire popped in the hearth. The man lit a lantern, then turned to her. "You got a name, Keziah," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "Keziah Granger. I am Lowell Mercer. You can sit if you want." She sat. Her muscles screamed in relief. He poured her water from a pitcher and handed it to her. She drank like she had not seen water in days. "You running from something?" he asked gently. "Someone," she said. "I was supposed to marry a man I never wanted. My father arranged it. I ran." Lowell's jaw clenched. He nodded once slowly, as if that told him everything he needed to know. "You have any family out this way?" "No." "I have nothing." He drew in a breath, fiddling with the edge of the table. "You can stay here tonight. I will put you in the back room. You will be safe." She met his eyes finally. They were a soft hazel, tired but kind. "Thank you." He gave a small nod, then moved to fetch a blanket from the chest near the fireplace. As he passed, she noticed the gold ring on a cord around his neck. It gleamed in the firelight before he tucked it back beneath his shirt. She did not ask. He led her to a small room with a narrow bed. The quilt was old but clean. She collapsed into it without another word. Lowell watched the door long after she had fallen asleep. He had not let anyone stay in that room in 5 years, not since Ellie died. He had promised himself he would never marry again, never love again. The world had taken too much already. But that woman had looked at him like he was the first safe thing she had seen in days, and something in his chest had stirred. By morning the storm had passed, and Keziah stood barefoot in the kitchen, her dress bundled in her arms. "This is ruined," she said quietly. Lowell glanced up from the stove. "There's an old dress of my sister's in the attic, might fit you." She smiled, just barely. "Thank you." He set a plate of eggs and bread in front of her. "Eat." She did slowly, watching him move. He was quiet but not cold. Everything he did was measured, careful. Like a man who had learned the hard way not to waste anything, including words. After breakfast, she helped gather eggs. He did not ask her to, but she followed him to the coop anyway. Her hands shook when she reached into the nests, but he showed her how, patient and calm. Later, she found the dress tucked neatly outside her door. She tried it on. It was faded blue cotton, worn soft. It fit well enough. She stood at the mirror, her hair loose and tangled around her shoulders, and for the first time in weeks, she saw someone who looked free. She stepped outside and found Lowell chopping wood. He looked up, paused mid-swing. "You look better," he said simply. She smiled. "I feel better." That night they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the hills. "I do not know what I am going to do," she said. "I cannot go back." "You do not have to," he said, "but I cannot stay here forever. You can stay as long as you want." She looked at him, really looked. "What about your wife?" she asked softly, his shoulders tensed. "She died 5 years ago. I am sorry." He nodded, eyes on the horizon. "I promised myself I would not go through that again, losing someone like that." Keziah did not speak. She just sat beside him, close enough that their arms brushed. After a long silence, he added, "But sometimes promises do not mean much when something real comes along." She turned toward him. He was already watching her, and though nothing was said, the air between them shifted, not fast. Not sudden, but real. The next days passed with a quiet rhythm. She helped with chores, learned to milk the cow, even helped mend a fence post after a storm knocked it loose. He taught her how to use a rifle, how to tell the difference between coyote tracks and a stray dog. They moved around each other like two people learning a new kind of trust. Then the sheriff came. Lowell stepped out onto the porch when he heard the horse. The sheriff tipped his hat. Got word from Denver. A bride ran off before her wedding. Her father's offering cash for help finding her. Lowell's jaw tightened. Word is she chose to leave. Still, he is claiming she was taken, says she is unstable. Keziah stood just inside the door, frozen. Lowell's voice was calm. Ain't no one here but me. The sheriff squinted past him. You sure? Lowell met his eyes. I do not lie, Sheriff. After a long pause, the sheriff nodded. All right, if you see anything, you let me know. Lowell did not answer when the sheriff rode off. Keziah stepped out. You lied, she said. I protected you, he said. She looked at him, heart thudding. Why? He looked back at her, steady and sure. Because I am not letting them take you back to a man you do not want, not while you are under my roof. Her throat tightened. You do not even know me. I know enough. He stepped closer. She could feel the heat of him, the steadiness, the part of her that had been running for months finally stilled. I promised I would never marry again, he said quietly, but you make me want to break that promise. She looked up at him, eyes wide. Lowell. I do not expect anything from you, but you are safe here, and if you want to stay, I want you to. Her eyes filled, but she smiled through it. I do. He reached for her hand, held it, and for the first time in a long time she felt like someone's choice, not someone's burden. Not someone's bargaining chip, just hers and his. The first frost settled quiet over the grass, silvering the tops of the hills beyond Lowell's pasture. Keziah stood barefoot on the porch, arms folded against the morning chill, watching the steam rise from the horses' backs as they moved slow through the corral. Behind her, the kettle hissed over the stove. Lowell poured hot water into a tin basin in the corner, then stepped back so she could wash. She never asked him to turn away, but he always did. You don't have to keep doing that, she said, drying her face with the edge of a clean rag. It's your space, he answered without turning around, not mine to take. She moved toward the table, the floorboards cool against her feet. You ever think about selling this place? He leaned a hip against the doorframe. Not once. Even with the winters, he gave a quiet breath through his nose, especially with the winters, keeps the world at a distance. Keziah tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. You like being hard to reach. He didn't answer right away, just looked out across the fields where the pale sun was beginning to lift the frost from the fence rails. It's not the distance I like, he said finally. It's the quiet. She didn't press him. Instead, she opened the cupboard, reaching for the flour sack. I can make biscuits if you've got lard. He nodded toward the cellar door, middle shelf behind the preserves. While she worked the dough, he brought in wood, shaking the cold from his coat. She caught the faint scent of pine smoke clinging to him, and something else, dry earth, iron. Maybe a touch of tobacco from the pouch he kept in his breast pocket but never used. By the time the biscuits went into the oven, her hands were dusted white and her cheeks were warm from the stove. She sat, elbows on the table, watching the fire dance behind the stove grate. Lowell broke the silence. I started building the barn the year after I came back, worked sunup to dark, never hired a hand. You built all of it, he gave a slow nod. Even the rafters, had to brace the beams alone. Took me 4 months longer than it should have. Why not hire someone? His eyes flicked to hers. I needed something to finish with my own hands. She didn't ask what he was working through. She understood the shape of grief by feel now where it settled, how it quieted a person from the inside out. When the biscuits were done, she set 2 on his plate, then 2 on hers. He added a stripe of honey and passed the jar without a word. The light shifted through the window as they ate, soft and gold across the worn table. He set his fork down. You done any bookkeeping? She looked up. A little. My mother kept ledgers for a boarding house in Golden. I used to help. I could use someone to track the cattle records. I've been keeping them in my head. And if you hit yours, he gave the barest flicker of a smile, then the herd disappears and no one knows why. She nodded once. I'll start this afternoon. Later, she sat cross-legged on the floor near the hearth with a tin box of loose receipts, tallying numbers in a fresh ledger book while Lowell repaired a stirrup strap across from her. She read out costs and weights, and he answered without looking up, his knife moving precise through the thick leather. As the sun dipped low, he asked, "Do you miss it?" "Miss what?" "The city." Keziah didn't answer right away. She set the pencil down and rubbed a smudge from the page with her thumb. "I miss knowing what day it is. I miss hearing piano music from a window I'll never see inside, but I don't miss being told who I am." He glanced up. "You know now, I think I'm learning." She closed the ledger and leaned back against the hearth. "Do you?" "I used to," he said. "Enough to let it slip away." She watched him for a moment, the light from the fire catching the bone of his jaw, the strong line of his neck as he bent over his work. "You keep to yourself," she said. He didn't look up. "I've found less breaks that way." "Maybe," she said quietly, "but less mending too." He set the strap aside and met her eyes across the fire. "You think I need mending? I think you've been holding the same breath for a long time." The room went still, save for the whisper of wind at the window. He stood cross to her and held out a hand. She took it and he pulled her to her feet. "I don't know what this is," he said, voice low. "But I know it's better than the quiet." Her hand stayed in his. "It's not a promise," she said. "No," he said. "It's a beginning." They stood there, firelight between them, hands joined like they'd never been apart. And in the hush of that moment, something old broke open, and something better took its place. The wind shifted sharp out of the north the following day, carrying the dry bite of early November. Keziah pulled her shawl tighter across her shoulders as she reached the far fence line, where Lowell stood studying a break in the wire. A mule deer had likely panicked in the night and pushed through. "We'll need to splice that," he said, brushing a gloved hand across the splintered post. She crouched beside it, examining the damage. "I can hold the wire while you wrap it." He gave her a look that held no doubt, only quiet agreement. "I'll fetch the spool." They worked without chatter, the only sound the rasp of wire sliding and the creak of the fence post as Lowell anchored it back into place. Keziah's fingers ached from the cold, but she didn't complain. He handed her a nail to hold between her teeth while he hammered, and when he straightened, his breath fogged the air just inches from hers. He paused there, not touching her, not speaking. Just searching her face like he was still trying to understand how she'd gone from stranger to necessity in the space of a season. She broke the silence. "You always fix things yourself, if I can." His voice was low. "Used to think it was pride. Now I think it's just habit." She leaned back on her heels. "Some things aren't meant to be mended alone." He didn't answer, but the way he looked at her said he'd heard it. They walked back slowly, the sun low enough now to cast long blue shadows across the pasture. At the house, she went straight to the barn, brushing down the mare they'd started calling Larkspur. Lowell watched from the loft ladder, a coil of rope in one hand. "You take to animals easy," he said. "My mother raised me on the edge of a mining camp," she replied, brushing slow along the mare's neck. "The horses were the only things that didn't ask for something in return." He descended the ladder and leaned against the stall. "You talk about her different than your father. She died when I was 16. Keziah didn't look up. "He married again a year later. That woman thought I was a burden, and he agreed." Lowell's hands curled around the edge of the stall. "A woman like you isn't a burden." She glanced up. "You didn't know me 2 months ago. I knew enough the day you walked into that barn and didn't ask for pity." They stood in that quiet for a long while, then she said, "I never learned to cook meat proper. My mother did the baking, not the butchering." "I'll teach you," he said. "If you don't mind the smell." "I've smelled worse." He smiled, not a flicker, but a full, honest thing that reached his eyes. That evening she stood beside him at the stove, sleeves rolled, hands slick with tallow as he showed her how to trim sinew from a cut of venison. He moved slow, careful not to crowd her but close enough she could feel the heat of him at her back. "Here," he said, guiding her wrist. "Sharp angle, let the knife pull." She followed the motion, then looked up. "Like that, better than I did the first time," she laughed, soft and surprised. "You got any brothers?" "One, older, died in the war." Her smile faded. "I'm sorry," he nodded once. "I was still a boy when he left, came back a man I didn't recognize, didn't last long after Appomattox. They didn't speak for a bit after that." The fire cracked and the scent of roasting meat filled the room. Later, after supper, she stood at the window watching the snow begin to fall, dry and fine. Behind her, Lowell stirred the embers in the stove, then crossed to her, close but not touching. "I've been thinking," he said. "About the land north of the creek. It's flat enough for another paddock. Maybe plant oats come spring." She nodded, eyes still on the snowfall. "You'll need help fencing it." "I'll have it." She turned then. He was looking at her the way a man looks when he's already made the decision but wants to know it's shared. "You want me to stay through spring?" she asked. "I want you to stay for good." Her heart beat so loud she could feel it in her fingertips. "You sure?" He took her hand, the one that had held wire that morning, the one that still bore a smear of flour from supper, and folded it between both of his. "I promised myself a long time ago that I'd never marry again," he said. "But I'd rather break that promise and build something true than keep it and lose you." She didn't cry. She just stepped into him, rested her forehead against his, and whispered, "Then let's build it." When he kissed her, it was slow, reverent, like he was learning her from the inside out. And outside, the snow kept falling, soft as breath against the earth that would hold their future. The wedding was held the third Sunday of December, 2 days before the solstice, when the sun hung low and gold over the hills, and the air carried the scent of juniper and wood smoke. Lowell didn't shave. Keziah didn't wear white. She walked across the snowy yard in a wool dress the color of river slate, her hair braided and pinned with a single pine sprig. Her boots were clean, but the soles were worn, just like her, just like him. They stood beneath the cottonwood behind the house where the wind couldn't reach, and the preacher from Redfern rode up by sled, his coat stiff with frost, his voice steady. They spoke no vows beyond what they meant. No one else watched, unless you counted the gelding nosing the fence rail or the hawk overhead circling quiet against the pale winter sky. Lowell took her hands in his, rough and warm. "You don't belong to anything that tried to break you," he said. "You're free. But if you choose this, then I'll carry it with you, every day." Keziah's voice didn't shake. "I never thought I'd want to belong to someone again, but I want this, if you do." He nodded once. "I do." After they shared bread and coffee inside, just the two of them. The fire hissed and popped, and snow slid from the eaves in slow sheets. The preacher had long since gone, leaving behind a signed paper and a small wooden cross she tucked into a drawer without comment. That night, she undid her braid beside the stove. Lowell sat nearby, bootless, shirt sleeves rolled, watching her with a stillness that made her feel steadier just standing in it. "You ever think it'd come to this?" she asked. "No," he said, "but I think my heart did, long before I let it." She crossed to him, took his face in her hands. "I don't want quiet to feel like loneliness anymore." "It won't," he said, resting his forehead against hers. "Not with you here." They didn't rush. Their hands were slow, reverent. He unfastened the buttons at her back like he was unwrapping something he never thought he'd be allowed to hold again. She traced the scar on his shoulder where a fence nail had once torn through, and he flinched, not from pain, but memory. They lay together beneath the quilt she'd mended weeks before, their breaths catching and meeting again, the silence between them full of everything they didn't need to say aloud. In the weeks that followed, they found a rhythm that didn't ask for permission. Keziah began grinding cornmeal by hand for breakfast cakes. Lowell repaired the hinges on the root cellar door before the storms came. She took to feeding the chickens early, before the frost could stiffen their combs. He built a second coop just past the smokehouse, where the light fell gentler in the morning. One morning she stood at the edge of the field, boots sunk in the snow, her hands buried in her coat. Lowell joined her, crunching over ice. "You thinking of spring?" he asked. "I'm thinking of what we'll plant," she said. "Oats, yes, but maybe squash too, maybe beans." "You think we can manage all that?" "We can manage anything," she said. "We already have." He looked out over the snow-covered pasture, then back at her. "Didn't know I could build something again." "Not after everything." "You didn't build it alone," she said. "I came here broken, but you didn't try to fix me. You let me mend in my own time." He reached for her hand, laced their fingers together. "That's the only kind of love I'll give, the kind that waits. The kind that stays." She turned into him, her cheek against his chest. "Then we'll stay." And in that still white world, with no one watching but the crows in the bare cottonwood branches, she knew with a certainty that needed no proof. The life they'd built wasn't loud or grand, but it was true. It was safe. It was theirs. And it would last. By mid-March, the snow had thinned to patchy crusts in the shadows, and the river behind Lowell's pasture ran fast and full from the mountain thaw. Keziah stood ankle-deep in cold mud, sleeves rolled, hands wrapped around a post she braced while Lowell tamped in gravel and packed the earth. The paddock was nearly finished, the last section of fence marking out room for the oat field they'd agreed to plant once the ground softened fully. "You ever think about adding sheep?" she asked, brow furrowed against the glare off the water. Lowell lifted his head. "Not unless we want to be out here chasing them every time the gate swings loose. They don't drift like cattle," she said, "but they'd give us wool. Maybe something steady to sell through winter." He leaned on the shovel, considering. "You ever raised sheep?" "I watched a family outside Golden do it. They spun their own yarn, sold it to a man who came with a wagon twice a year. Paid fair too." He nodded slowly, then tightened the wire with a final pull. "If we're spinning, I'll need to build a wheel." "I could ask around town," she said. "There was a widow near the West Ridge who used to card wool. I think she's still there." Lowell wiped his hands on his trousers. "You've got a mind for what'll last." "I never had the chance to think ahead before." They finished the fence by dusk. Keziah brushed her palms clean on her skirt and looked out over the plot, already picturing the rose oats on the rise, squash in the lower stretch, beans against a trellis they'd yet to build. Inside, she lit the lamp while Lowell brought in the day's eggs. She set water to heat for washing, then knelt by the cupboard where she'd begun lining the bottom shelf with folded cloth, some she'd hemmed from old shirts, others from bolts she'd bargained for in Redfern last month. Lowell came in brushing straw from his sleeves. "You brought back fabric when you went to trade for seed." "I had a few coins left. Thought we'd need something decent to hang in the windows." He stepped closer, hand resting on the top of the cupboard. "You're making this place into something I never thought it could be." She looked up from the cloth, meeting his eyes. "You gave me the space to belong. I'm just filling it." Later that week, they rode into Redfern together, the wagon bed empty save for the feed sacks Lowell planned to fill and the list Keziah carried tucked in her pocket. She wore her dark green cloak, the one she'd sewn herself, and he drove with one hand on the reins, the other resting on his thigh, thumb rubbing slow against the worn fabric of his trousers. As they passed the outskirts of town, a wiry man with a crooked hat waved them down. "You're the one with the Granger woman," he said to Lowell. "Her father was through last month asking questions." Lowell's hand tensed on the reins. "He's not coming back," didn't say, but he didn't look kindly when he left. Keziah stepped down from the wagon without waiting. "He can search every ridge from here to Cheyenne. I'm not hiding." The man tipped his hat awkwardly. "Didn't mean offense, miss," she nodded once. "None taken." They left him in the dust and didn't speak of it again. After the feed store, they stopped by the small stone church, where the preacher's wife handed Keziah a basket of wool cuttings. "They're rough," she said, "but good for learning." Back home, Keziah set up a corner by the window where the light held longest, her makeshift spindle balanced on a stool as she worked the wool with patient hands. Lowell watched her from the porch some evenings, arms folded, a quiet pride in the way his gaze lingered. By April, she'd spun enough to start a blanket. She worked on it in the early mornings before chores when the world was still and the stove warm. "You're up early," Lowell said one morning, stepping into the kitchen with a bucket of fresh milk. "I'm nearly to the edge," she said, fingers moving in rhythm. "Want it finished by first frost." He poured the milk, then leaned over to press a kiss to her temple. "It'll be a good first winter." That night, as they sat by the fire, Keziah reached into a small cedar box and pulled out the ring she'd found tucked in the bottom drawer months ago, the one on the chain Lowell used to wear under his shirt. "I thought about giving this back," she said. "But it's yours, and it's part of what made you." He took it, turned it in his palm. "It belonged to Ellie. I kept it because I couldn't stand to let go," she nodded. "You don't have to. Nothing you had with her makes what we have less." He looked at her, eyes steady. "It doesn't." She reached for his hand. "Then keep it, but you don't have to wear it anymore." He slipped the chain back into the box and closed the lid. "I want to give you one of your own." "I don't need one. I want to." The next week, he traded 2 cured hides to a craftsman in town and brought home a plain silver band carved with a pattern of wheat stalks. "Felt right," he said, sliding it onto her finger. "You're the one growing things now." Spring turned full by May, the oats took root. The chickens nested often. Lowell began plans for a loom, and Keziah drew up a list of the dye plants she hoped to grow indigo if she could find the seed. Onion skins for golds. Madder root for red if she could track some down. One warm morning, she stood at the edge of the creek with her boots off, hem lifted, toes in the mud. Lowell came up behind her, arms circling her waist. "I never thought I'd have this," he said, voice low against her ear. "This piece, you," she leaned back into him. "It's ours now." "No one's taking it." He turned her gently, kissed her under the cottonwood where the leaves had just unfurled. And they stayed that way a long time, breath mingling, the sun warm on their backs, the world soft and still around them, 2 people who had lived through ruin and found in each other something worth keeping. Years passed. The paddocks filled with sheep. The loom turned out blankets